Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We're going to take a look at non-conference schedules around the SEC today. Don't look now, but we're, 2.5 months from first pitch of the 2025 college baseball season, and because of the holidays and what have you, that's going to be here a lot quicker than you think. So we're going to take a look at some non-conference schedules. We've talked about the conference slates. We previewed that a little bit when those schedules were announced. Not all non-conference slates have been officially announced in the SEC, but most of them have. And even for the teams that haven't fully announced their schedule, we know the big important stuff. So we're going to jump into this episode now. So we will talk about all of that in just a second. But first, I have to let you know that this episode of Highway to Hoover and every episode of Highway to Hoover is brought to you by PitchLogic, the system used by players, coaches, scouts, and instructors at all levels of play, from youth leagues to the big leagues. The easy-to-use and affordable technology makes the platform accessible to every player at every level. All the metrics and features used at the highest level. See pitchlogic.com for more information. All right, Mark, let's before we get into any specifics here, because we do have a little bit of a format just to keep Mark and I on track here, but you've done a lot of crunching on these schedules. So you've done a lot of the kind of legwork on getting underneath the surface here. Before we get going and talk about some specific schedule items, as you did some of that digging, do any big picture things stand out to you about the way SEC teams crafted their non-conference schedules?
Yeah, lots of home games. I mean,
Shocking.
pre-conference, I mean, it's other than Mizzou and Kentucky.
Right.
I
Which kind of
mean,
have to go on the road in some ways.
mhm, yeah, just a lot of home games. And Vandy has two tournaments, so that's not home games. So they have two of them away from home, as does Texas. One's in state, but still it's not home. But yeah, as far as road series, I mean, Kentucky has those two to open it up. I mean, they go to Lipscomb, they go to Belmont. Georgia goes to Wilmington, and of the ones that have been released, that's it. There are no more non-conference road, series. There's some single game things, for midweek, but on the weekend, that's it. Of the ones that have been released. So, um, it's not going to help your RPI, but if you're in a league like the SEC, if you take care of business in conference, it's probably not going to matter.
Yeah.
But it's definitely one of those where if you look similar to one of your brethren and they have some non-conference, advantages on the road compared to you, it very well could come back to bite you. But you know, it, but it's kind of the rarity at this point. But that's really the biggest call out for me is just there's just a lot. I mean, Florida doesn't go on the road at all. They don't even have a tournament for the non-conference, pre-conference, I should say.
Yeah.
All 4 weekends are in Gainesville. That's
Yeah.
the biggest call out. Yep.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things happening there. I mean, we could probably have a larger discussion that may not necessarily, or maybe it is a topic for today. I don't know. But there's just a lot that I feel like goes into that. I think there's a perception outside of the league that it's just kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, cowardice, right? Of like, we're just going to play cupcakes and what have you. And obviously it's not that simple. I mean, are there some schedules we wish were a little bit heavier? Like, sure. From an entertainment
Yeah.
standpoint, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But we understand also that in an era where athletic department revenue has never been more important, like, and
Mm-hmm.
baseball is, not the money driver for these athletic departments, that, not having to spend a bunch of money to go on the road and be able to bring in some ticket revenue is not nothing to these schools,
Right.
right? There's also, as you say, like, the most important games are your 30 SEC games. And yes, it can help if you go to a tournament in Houston or Arlington or whatever and go 3-0. But the most important data point is going to be that you play well in SEC play. And so there is a little bit of um, what's the motivation there? And I think you can make the flip side argument, though, Mark. I mean, I'm going to argue with myself here, is that also because the 30 SEC games the most important thing, like, is it really hurting you if you go or even if you bring in like a really good West Coast team or whatever. And I know maybe the West
Mhm.
Coast is a bad example because they're probably cash strapped in a way that the SEC isn't, obviously. Um, but I just think there's a lot that goes into all that, and I think the current climate where every dollar counts right now, even for schools that appear to be printing money, I think is certainly a factor at play.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a lot of this, as you said, is budget driven, and it's also kind of one of those things that okay, you can do this. You're allowed to do this if you're an SEC program. Where if you're one because of the weather, two because you have the resources to do it. There'd be a lot of coaches who would love to have all of their non or the majority of their non conference games at home, but they can't because of various factors. So it's kind of one of those things that we do it because we can, and it also in many cases doesn't hurt me. So I'm quote allowed to do it. So as people who like to publicize the sport and like to go to big events, and would I love to see you know a LSU go somewhere non-conference and play somebody really good, go to Virginia, something like that, or maybe Virginia go to LSU. I'm sure so either way, you get a home and home, that would be exciting. But that's really not the model. Other than Miami goes to Florida, and they do home and home every year. This year it's Florida's got them in Gainesville. But that's other than a few that do the multi venue. South Carolina and Clemson are doing that, but there's even that's gone away because Georgia and Georgia Tech are not doing that either. So it's kind of a rarity at this point to have a true road series before conference play, which is kind of goes into a point where a lot of these clubs during the fall are taking a road trip so that their players can at least get a taste of a road environment. Yeah, it's not the same, but you are having people yell against you where really you're not going to get that till March in many of these places because yeah, you might go to a tournament and it's neutral and it's really not a road environment in most of them. So I do think that that's another factor. When you're scheduling is what did you do in the fall to help some of your young guys or your players who are stepping up in level to see how they respond on the road.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because I think that would be an argument for the road thing is just like go somewhere where it's going to be a hostile environment and you have to
Yeah.
deal with that. And I mean, even if it's frankly, it's harder during the midweeks. I get it, but even if it was a little bit of like a midweek series, right, where you
Hmm.
go play 2 back-to-back days somewhere
Hmm.
where you can drive, that kind of thing. Um, that'd be interesting to me. But I would say one of the positives of the current climate and scheduling is that the sheer volume of good tournaments
Hmm.
has really kind of popped. Now, some have
Yeah.
gone away that I wish we'd get back, right? Like there isn't as much going on in Arizona opening weekend as there used to be. It feels like, the Tony Gwynn tournament
Hmm.
doesn't have the buzz that it has had. So we can sit here and nitpick, but for the most part, because of what they're doing in Arlington, where they've got a tournament every weekend for the first few weeks, and Houston's obviously still around, and there's just a lot going on those first few weeks. It is kind of boom times for these tournaments, and that I guess segues to our first kind of topic here is that I'm curious your thoughts on what of the tournaments that are being played, what intrigues you most, because this is, I mean, you can just about every SEC team is playing in one of these.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what catches your eye when you look at the slate of tournaments.
Hmm. I think the opening weekend you have Ole Miss and Texas. In Arlington, Ole Miss has got Arizona. They actually will play Texas, which is kind of
Yeah.
a
Interesting.
interesting
Yeah.
thing. And Clemson, Texas has Louisville, Ole Miss, and Oklahoma State. I mean, those are two programs that we have a lot of interest in. Ole Miss made an assistant, coaching change, has a pitching coach now. It's a big year in Oxford. Um, that will be a fascinating look opening weekend because they're jumping into the fire, facing some good competition, and then Texas with Schloss there. It'll be a lot of interest to see how they respond coming out of the coaching change. A lot of new players. What do they look like? And also, coming into the SEC from the Big 12. So uh, that to me is one that really stands out. I think Vandy week 3, they've got UCLA, USC, and Connecticut. I don't remember where that is, but
It's in
I
LA.
think it is in LA, right?
Yeah.
Um, one Vandy's, they also will have kind of a new look, have some new components to their coaching staff. UConn was really good last year, won a regional, and then with USC and UCLA changing leagues, going to the Big Ten, what do they look like, right? And I think getting to play a team like Vandy, that will be fascinating. I don't want to steal them all, but I think I'll go one more,
Yep.
and that one would be Alabama in week 2, going to Jacksonville, Coastal Carolina, NC State, and Ohio State. I mean, that's a pretty good field as well. 3 regional teams, and then Ohio State with a new coaching staff. So that has more intrigue than perhaps it would in a normal year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, some good ones there. I had the Ole Miss weekend on my list, the Ole Miss weekend in
Hmm.
Arlington. I'm more fascinated in the Ole Miss side of it just because knowing what we know about the importance of this season and them getting back on track, this will be a good
Hmm.
early litmus test. Don't go 0-3, but I think it's less about the wins and losses
How do
and
you
more
play?
about, do you look like you belong on the field with these teams? Because
Hmm.
ultimately, Texas is a team that's going to have Omaha aspirations. Clemson is a team that's going to have Omaha aspirations. And Arizona probably in that mix too, although I just don't know as much about their roster at this point. Shout out to Runes' fall report on
Hmm.
Arizona. I should probably go read it. But obviously, it's a high standard there as well. And do you look like
Yeah.
you're in this group? Like that's the thing. And so if you
Hmm.
go 1-2, but you have like an extra inning loss, and okay, you ran out of pitching against a really good Clemson team on Sunday. Okay, like you can deal with that.
Hmm.
But is it woof? It's 0-3. They weren't really competitive. You know, uh, it's not everything, but man, they just really need to make an impression early in the
Yeah,
season to give
absolutely.
confidence that they're going to be ready to compete in the SEC. I would say the other one for me is actually a little bit off the board. Missouri's going to Puerto Rico in the first
Yeah.
weekend of the season. Um, and there's interesting on-field stuff here. Like, they've got UConn. Obviously, we know UConn is good every year. Stetson was in a regional last year. Penn State, who knows? They were better last
Mhm.
year. I think they'll be decent. But for me, it's more about, one, can Mizzou, and I think we talked about this going into last year. Maybe I forget who Mizzou had opening weekend, maybe Cal Poly or something. But they
Yeah.
travel opening weekend, and
Mhm.
um, do they just look like a better team than their opposition? Now, if they don't look better than UConn, fine. Like UConn's good,
Mhm.
but like with Penn State and Stetson, like do you just take care of business there? Because one thing that Missouri has always kind of struggled with is they'll go to these preseason tournaments, and okay, yes, they don't really, they probably haven't practiced outside much, and yada yada yada, but as an SEC club, you'd like to see them go into some of these places and just look like the more talented team, right?
Yeah.
And that just hasn't happened a ton. And I get that they're rebuilding. We know all that. So that's one thing. But also from just a larger college baseball standpoint, I am curious to see how this tournament does, and if this tournament kind of ends up being a one and
Mhm.
done, that was kind of cool, and then goes away, or if it's something that builds. This tournament was in the works a few years ago. I think that kind of the post COVID uncertainty derailed it for a few years, and now they're actually running it. Um, Selfishly, I'd love to see it continue because one year I'd like to go down there, but it's
Yeah.
also just that I think it can be a cool opportunity if you're a coach. Like, do a little recruiting down there, see what you can get done. I'm sure a school like Rice, who is coached by Jose Cruz Jr., who is of Puerto Rican descent, will perhaps see that as an opportunity, right? I believe Mizzou, and I don't want to make too many, but Mizzou, I believe, has a coach of Puerto Rican descent on their staff. Like, so perhaps there are some
Mhm.
opportunities there. But I just think it's cool for college baseball and a good thing for college baseball to get a pretty diverse set of tournaments here to kind of grow the sport and put more eyes on it. And I think Puerto Rico is probably a market that's a little bit untapped, not really so much for making a bunch of
Yeah.
fans of college baseball, but just in terms of players and getting them over here to play college
Yeah.
baseball instead of going into the draft or, whatever it is. So, um, I'm going to be interested. I don't know if it's streaming. I genuinely don't know. Like, I don't know what the streaming situation or whatever will be. So I don't even know if we'll really get to watch it. But I will be interested to talk to some of these coaches afterwards and get their impressions on how it was run and what it was like and what they think about, future years.
Yeah, I enjoy the novelty part of it, right?
Yeah.
Anytime something is unique, and this will be, and I mean, there are going to be a few of those around the country, but there's not many. It's kind of the same places, and you have a different group of teams, and the honestly, the novelty piece for a lot of these other tournaments is you're hoping that you get that, that ace on ace, in game one or something like that. Where this is just totally, it's in a different venue. It's a logistical challenge, to get everyone there, and it's just to your point, just a whole different way, a whole different route for college baseball to take. And you mentioned opening up avenues for players. I mean, if the whole scholarship thing comes into play, you're going to have access to get some players that perhaps, you didn't have access before. It'll be a little bit easier sell to get them on campus. And that's certainly great for our sport. So
No doubt.
excited about that.
No doubt. I mean, it's such a good point because there are a decent number and there are Puerto Rican players in college baseball. I'm not suggesting this
Mhm.
totally new ground, but you see more of them, frankly, at like the junior college level, and
Yeah.
and that's typically how they matriculate to Division I schools. But it would be nice to get more 4-year players from Puerto Rico, and perhaps this is an opportunity. To your point, a player who might have otherwise gone to a junior college, maybe you can get them onto a Division I campus and get that done. So yeah, I'm
Or
kind of
or even gone pro, right?
right.
Because
Yeah.
a lot of times if and you have people from all over the place, right? All ethnicities, all locations. College is expensive, and this
Yes.
is a partial revenue sport. So if you can open that door to allow, just a larger subset of people to be able to afford to come play baseball in college, I mean, that's huge for the sport from just a talent influx standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinated to see it. Looking forward to seeing how that plays out, both on the field and in the bigger picture.
Mhm.
Let's um let's move on to some series, Mark. And this is where it's kind of tricky
Yep.
because, like you mentioned, not a lot of road,
Mhm.
not a lot of we'll talk about the rivalry series kind of separately. I have a little note about that at the end here, but
Yeah.
um, so outside of the rivalry series, I have a few here. I'll tell you what. Let me give you a couple, and then we'll go from there. I'm kind of interested in Air
Alright.
Force at Florida opening weekend.
Yeah.
Uh, Air Force gave Mississippi State a series last year. They were in a regional 2 years ago. Some guy named Paul Skeens came from there. Don't know if you've heard of
Yeah.
him. Um, they're putting talent. I don't know what has changed at Air Force. This is maybe a story that I should track down and write for the site. But the last 5 to 7 years, like Air Force has like, to use a metaphor, turned on the jets and
Yeah.
has gotten a lot better. And so they're frisky. Like, this is not your father's Air Force in terms of, okay, cool. Like, they're going to come in here and it's unique that we're playing the Air Force Academy and we're going to beat them 3 times, then send them home. These guys are pretty good. And so I think if Florida comes out a little bit flat opening weekend, which would
Mhm.
be understandable. Opening weekend against a non-conference foe and somebody you probably assume you're going to handle pretty easily. Like, I think Air Force um, could be frisky there. Certainly they're going to be game for it. I don't think you have to have any doubts about that. So let's ping pong a little bit here, Mark. Why don't you hit me
Yeah.
with a series you're interested in?
Yeah. Going to Fayetteville opening weekend, Washington State comes in 4-game set. So, we're really kinda, itching to see that Arkansas pitching staff, and you're gonna get 4 opportunities, to see how they work that weekend set. So really excited about that against a quality team. Washington State's certainly in a flux from a program standpoint is they wait to rejoin the Pac-12. Um, so so it'll be interesting to see what kind of team they put together and going into to face an Arkansas club that's going to be top five ish in the country, certainly among the best in the land. And that to your point, just like the Florida series with Air Force, that's opening weekend. We're going to get pretty good. Have some fun with it right off the bat.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly, Washington State was not a good Pac 12 program, but like they've still got Pac 12 players in that roster. It's definitely
Hmm.
a step up from, I don't want to disparage anybody, but pick your
Yeah,
average mid major team, right? Like it's going to
right.
be a step up from that. So, um, I'm interested in that as well. I had that on my list. I think the biggest one for me is Georgia playing at UNCW. And this one's a
Yeah.
little bit wonky because it's my understanding this is largely because Georgia is not 100% on having fully field ready for opening weekend.
Hmm.
So they hedged their bets a little bit, wanted to go on the road. UNCW already had something scheduled with Quinnipiac, but said, "Hey, if you want to cut in, come on down." Obviously, that's a mixed bag because you're going to get good games against UNCW. Those will be a little bit offset probably by Quinnipiac. Even if Quinnipiac's good, that RPI is not going to be great. So there is that. But from an entertainment standpoint, that's hard to beat. I mean, it's a road series. It's a perennial regional team in UNCW that has at least a handful and probably more guys who could play on SEC rosters, including Georgia.
Hmm.
Tanner Thatch is one of the best hitters in the country, just for one name there. Um, so there's a chance that that series, I think at a bare minimum is competitive.
Yeah.
I think Georgia will probably win it, but like there's a very non-zero chance that Wilmington wins that series, and it's not too terribly surprising, right? Because that team's just
Hmm.
good, and
Right.
they're always old, they're always talented. So unless something changes kind of last minute here,
Hmm.
I think that might be where I go opening weekend because that's an hour and a
Yeah.
half down the road from me, so it's pretty convenient.
Right.
But I'm intrigued. To me, it's probably opening weekend in terms of series, probably the most interesting one for me.
Yeah. I think next I'll go, and Tennessee has not released their series or their schedule, but Samford has, and Samford will go to Tennessee week two.
It's a good one.
Samford's going to be pretty good. I mean, from a mid-major standpoint, it's kind of an interesting thing when I was talking to Tony David, the Samford head coach. They went to LSU 2 years ago, the Skeens year and Cruz, and they went down there, and yeah, they wanted to go down there and win the series, but realistically, they felt like, okay, we want to get better. We want to understand, what it's going to take to compete at that level. And they went down there and kind of got thumped a little bit, but they got a whole lot better by facing that top level competition that carried them through the rest of their season. And I encourage you to go read the Samford fall report where we talked about that. But I thought that was an interesting perspective because we're looking at it mostly from an SEC standpoint, but the SEC teams are the standard for so many clubs around the country, and for you to get to go in, experience that environment, and be able to gain something from it that's going to help them when they aren't playing the Tennessee and LSU's of the world. Um, I think that's a real teaching point and a coaching advantage. That if you can do it right, to carry you through and have success going forward. And then the other part of that is, Samford played Ole Miss and LSU in the fall, and they didn't look like they didn't belong. So that will be a you know probably not going to go in there and win the series in Knoxville, but Tennessee will at least have get some good competition, which is only going to help them, once SEC play starts.
Agreed. That's a very good one. And another team, like you don't have to wonder, like, is Samford going to come ready to play? Like, no, that
Right?
group, they're going to be ready.
They're going to fight.
Yeah, exactly. I am intrigued by. I'm going to talk Vanderbilt Xavier. They play the
Hmm.
Musketeers the week before SEC play starts, and that can be tricky, right?
Yeah.
If you're kind of like looking ahead to to SEC play, they have a road series at Auburn that next week. so you can get caught there a little bit, but also like Xavier looks the part of like that, not really all that sexy, not that
Mm-hmm.
prospecty, but like that lineup is old, old, old. Like I did their fall report, so I kind of know that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just a really old lineup full of dudes who've been good for them for multiple years. And that tends to be the kind of mid-major team that gives folks problems.
Yeah.
Like there are teams that have better prospects, even at the mid-major level. There are teams that have won more games. But like they're going to be one of the oldest teams at the mid-major level. I think they've got a chance to win the Big East this year. Well, probably not because UConn, but coming second in the Big East this year, and maybe challenge UConn. And so it's one of those deals where again, if Vanderbilt could lose a game here in this series, certainly at a bare minimum. And so if they don't come to play, Xavier's going to take advantage of that. There are questions on the mound for Xavier, so I will say if Vanderbilt's offense is better as they're hoping it is, as they think it is, that could be where maybe they make a little hay. And if they blow Xavier out, it's probably because Xavier didn't throw enough strikes and they feasted on their
Mm-hmm.
pitching. Like that's the scenario. But if they get into like this like rock fight where it's like
Yeah.
10-9 or something like that, like Xavier's going to be ready for that kind of party. Like they're ready to scrap and they're old. So intrigued by that one.
Yep. So next, I will go to Missouri's week 3. They host Evansville, and this will be the first home weekend, games for Missouri after the first two in neutral sites. So playing a team who won a regional last year shocked the world. So granted, both teams will look quite a bit different this year, but I do think that's a wonderful tune-up to get them ready to see where they are before SEC play starts. They'll have Binghamton the week after, but that week 3 is a lot of times when you want to play your toughest non-conference opponent, and then you have kind of week 4 in case you have some nagging injuries. You can kind of get guys right, and maybe you don't stretch people out as much, and have them primed for the conference opener. But I do think that's a fun one because you know everyone is going to pick Missouri 16 out of 16 this year, and over the years we were picking them 14 out of 14 a lot of years, and they rarely, if ever, finished there. So it's going to be fascinating to see what does Missouri look like? How much have they improved in year 2 under Carrick, and what are they looking at against a quality mid major like Evansville?
It's another good one. And kudos to Carrick Jackson and that staff for scheduling like a tricky mid major. Like a lot of times
Hmm.
there's kind of getting scared off from that. So you like that. Side note with that Binghamton series, and I don't
Hmm.
say this to make a joke. Anybody who's listened to this show knows that Mark and I are not in the business of like making light of the fact that like, yeah, like Mizzou doesn't have a great stadium situation. It is
Yeah.
what it is. However, they play Binghamton at home in Columbia. Binghamton's baseball stadium is better than Mizzou's.
Hmm.
Like, and again, that's less of like a damning statement for Mizzou, although it is, and more so just that Binghamton got $60 million dropped in their lap to build a baseball stadium. So if you're not aware of this, do yourself a favor and just do a Google search for Binghamton's baseball stadium, and it's for a program that, all due respect, isn't that successful. Like it is incredible what they have built at Binghamton, and kudos to them. Like we should want this, right? Like
Hmm.
throw $60 million at your not great baseball program in the America East, and and build them a new like go for it. That's and maybe send a few of that to Mizzou, and they can maybe get some things done at Taylor Stadium. Um, Speaking of the state of Missouri, Mississippi State is getting a visit from Missouri State second weekend, February
Yeah.
21st through 23rd. I don't know how competitive Missouri State will be here. I also did their fall report. The pitching has a lot of questions, but I have this one here because Missouri State has perhaps, and I don't want to be definitive because Lord knows I don't know every roster around the country, what might be the best player not playing in a power conference in an outfielder named Caden Bogenpool, who has, 70 grade raw power. He runs, he steals bases, he's a center fielder. Like he's a little bit of a poor man's Jace Laviolette in that he's not, you don't look at him and go like, man, now there's a twitchy athlete. but he's like a good runner. He's big, he's strong, he's got raw power. And he may not be that poor a man's Jace Laviolette, honestly. Like it might be like a slightly less wealthy man's Jace Laviolette. He also pitches and is like 98 off the mound. He, but the thing about it is they need him so badly on offense that they don't really want to pitch him that much.
Yeah.
For fear of like him getting injured or just like it taxing him or what have you. So he doesn't actually pitch that much. And it's my understanding there's also not a lot of polish there on the mound. So it is what it is, but they are hoping to get him on the mound. So anyway, if you're a Mississippi State fan that's going to be at that series, like Caden Bogenpool is the name to know there. He stuck at Missouri State. I don't know for certain. I have to imagine his DMs were blowing up this summer because he could play at, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, like he could have played at almost literally any program in America that he wanted to. And he stuck it out at Missouri State for at least one more year. So a cool player to watch in a series that I'm not sure how competitive it will be. Missouri State's talented, but certainly a player for you to watch if you're just kind of there to take it in.
Well, the next one for me would be Wofford going to Kentucky week 4. Wofford was in a regional last year and honestly gave LSU all they could handle in that opener. It's a good club. I mentioned Samford earlier. Those are two really good clubs out of the SoCon. And going to Kentucky, Kentucky's a team that we're going to talk about them a lot as the season gets closer. They lost everybody, man. It's a whole new looking roster. So they won't be the first team to bring in a whole bunch of guys and it click. It's just challenging to do it. So that's going to be fascinating, as they take on, the best opponent, at least on paper, that they're going to face in pre-conference, and how do they respond? I think that for me is going to be a fascinating series.
Similar to my Missouri State, Mississippi State series, A&M plays Elon opening weekend, and I don't foresee Elon being, famous last words. I don't foresee Elon being overly competitive to win that series. That's not my point here. However, much like Caden Bogenpool from Missouri State, Elon has an ace named Justin Mitrovich, who is nasty. And, it's mid 90s, it's sync, it's like command of all of his pitches. He really knows what he's doing. They do a pretty good job at Elon developing pitching. So if you told me A&M wins that series or even sweeps it, but they really had to sweat out whatever game Justin Mitrovich starts, which is probably Friday, I wouldn't be shocked. Because the guy's really good. He's SEC good. So that'll be a good test out of the gate for a really good A&M offense. And furthermore, poor Justin Mitrovich, if that start doesn't go great, he's going to have to fight against that ERA for the rest of the season, which is not great. But I think that should be a really good matchup. It'll probably be Mitrovich Prager. And honestly, even if they'll be on pitch counts because it's opening weekend, that'll honestly be a pretty interesting, 3, 4, or 5 innings, whatever it is, because both of those guys are really, really good. And those are guys that are going to have pro careers.
Yeah, that is a good one. Probably the other one I would go with here would be Charlotte going to Arkansas week 3. And Arkansas's that's a challenging set. They got Washington State week 1, got a tournament with K-State, TCU, and Michigan week 2, Charlotte in week 3, and a Portland club that's pretty good in week 4. So, Arkansas is not always scheduled that challenging, but they at least, based
good
on intended strength of schedule, it's going to be pretty good. We'll see how these teams pan out. But, Charlotte's a club that's regional contender, been in several regionals, good solid program. I do think that that's one to definitely watch.
My last one, I don't know if you had any more there after that, Mark. I got my last one. Okay. My last one is Georgia. They've got Columbia March 7 through 9. Columbia and Penn are kind of the two teams that from the Ivy League, if they pop up on your schedule, you're like, oh, okay, that's going to be a little different. Right. No disrespect to Brown, but it's not a series against Brown. It's it's real. And if you don't believe me, and I'm sure most listeners do, because Penn won a series at A&M a couple of years ago. Like it just Columbia got to a regional final in 2022. Like Auburn fans know all about Penn, right? So
Yeah.
most people listening to this are on board here. But like just poke around the SEC and look for the Columbia grad transfers because they're out there. Like Hayden Schott was a Columbia grad transfer. Kentucky has one now in Cole Hagee. So there are others I know I'm forgetting, but I'm actually working on a story about Columbia and Penn and kind of how they moved out of like a really tough period of time with the COVID stuff and losing their grad transfers and all that, and have thrived even in that kind of headwinds. But Columbia could get you, like even with Georgia being as good as we think they could be. Like Columbia is a team they play a really difficult schedule every year. So that's going to be tricky. Like Columbia could come out and play well in that series, and at least give Georgia a little bit of a scare, because that tends to be kind of what they do. Let's talk a couple rivalry series real quick, Mark. And part of the reason I bring this up is, as you may have noticed, certainly if you're a Georgia fan, Georgia Tech, which only recently moved to a weekend deal, is not this year. They're going back to, I think it's even just one midweek game this year.
One game.
Yeah. First of all, I'm on team. That sucks. Like I like that they moved that to a weekend. I thought that was a cool deal. I covered that a couple of years ago and had a lot of fun. It was a traveling series, kind of like South Carolina and Clemson. I hope that it returns to the weekend at some point in the future. I'm certainly not alone on that, but we still do have Clemson, South Carolina. We have Miami and Florida. Of the rivalry series, what is interesting to you there? It feels like maybe it's not, again, another famous last word, maybe not the most marquee year for these rivalry series, SEC, ACC, but I'm curious what stands out to you.
Well, I think if I could veer off course a little bit,
Sure.
Oklahoma State.
Oh, sure. That's a great one. I mean, thank you
Yeah,
for,
I mean, not a weekend gig this
Yeah,
year, only
right.
one game, and it's in Stillwater late in the year. So that one for me will be fascinating. I do think that, with Florida, not only do they host Miami, but they've got the 3 games, 3 sites, 3 different midweek games with Florida State. So
Yeah.
you've got, one in Jacksonville and one each on campus. And Florida State's going to be really good. So that's obviously Florida as well. So those are probably the highlights for me. And you mentioned Georgia Tech, that being I think that one will be in the Brave Stadium. But Georgia also goes to Clemson. So, and those are late in the season, should have good weather, which should mean good crowds. And I think those for me unless you want to go to Mississippi, and I'll leave those for you, but those will probably be the most marquee midweek rivalry kind of games.
Yeah, we'll take them how we can get them. Certainly, it certainly beats the heck out of not getting them played.
Mm-hmm.
But weekends are always preferable. Obviously, Pulmonary's first, that
Mm-hmm.
rivalry series, Pulmonary at the helm will be interesting. I mean, South Carolina's entire season is going to be interesting from that standpoint. But that series really delivered last year. I covered that one last year, and it was that one really delivered, even though it was cut short, 2 games.
There were
That
just
happened
2
last year.
games.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. I was there and don't remember it as well as you do, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
But that's life. Yeah. So certainly hoping that those rivalry series deliver. They always seem to, even when it looks like a year where it's like, like it may not be
Mm-hmm.
the big year for those. It always seems like they deliver. That is going to do it for this edition of the Highway to Hoover podcast, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. I want to thank Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of Highway to Hoover, and thank Mark for joining me as always. And thank you, the listener, for listening. We'll talk to y'all soon.